Hello, I'm Moni Vargas, the Creative and Program Director at Breakthrough, a nonprofit culture change organization that uses media, arts, and tech to promote human rights. Welcome to Breakthrough Spotlight, our weekly video and podcast series featuring conversations with community leaders, activists, artists, and partner organizations working to build a world that is more equitable, inclusive, and sustainable for all. Thanks for joining us.
Welcome to Breakthrough Spotlight. I'm Sohini, and I'm the President and CEO of Breakthrough. In honor of Breakthrough's 20-year of amazing journey, I'll be joined today by the founder and former President and CEO of Breakthrough, Mallika Dutt. Mallika Dutt leads Interconnected, a new initiative that uplifts the independent nature of self, community, and planet to advance collective well-being. She brings together the power of ancient wisdom and spiritual practices with contemporary technologies and storytelling. To us, she would always remain the wise and visionary founder of Breakthrough. Mallika served as the founder, president, and CEO of Breakthrough till March 2017. She has twice been named one of Verb's top 50 most influential women and has received multiple awards in recognition of her human rights activism, including the 2016 Skoll Award for Social Entrepreneurship. Mallika is co-founder of Sakhi for South Asian Women. Over to you, Mallika. Welcome to Spotlight.
Hi, Sohini. How exciting is it that we're getting to have this conversation with each other? 20 years of Breakthrough, and here we are. So, Madam President, how does it feel to be the President and CEO of Breakthrough, especially in the middle of a pandemic? What's going on with you?
It feels fantastic. At the same time, it feels a bit weird. I feel very humble that I'm able to be steering an organization like Breakthrough through this kind of a situation. So it's a very humbling thought, and it's a scary thought at times. So yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about that as well. So Mallika, can you talk to our audience today about how Breakthrough got started?
So, I started out in the human rights field when I was in college. And, I was one of those sort of very excited activists, full of anger, full of piss and vinegar, really into wanting to change everything in the world. And I was really fortunate to then go to law school, go to graduate school, and start an organization called Sakhi for South Asian Women that worked with battered South Asian women in New York City. I was working at a law firm, doing a lot of pro bono, amazing human rights cases on asylum, abortion, while I was doing a lot of the corporate stuff. And then I went on to become the director of a small foundation and really got to experience civil rights and social justice issues across the United States. I got to travel in the United States in a way that I had never really done, especially coming in as an immigrant, as a student. And then I became part of this incredible global women's movement that was pushing for the recognition of women's rights as human rights. And it sounds a little absurd to even say that we were at a point in, the late 80s and the early 90s where women just did not figure in the global public policy arena. They were not recognized in the human rights field. And certainly issues like gender-based violence and reproductive rights were not seen as human rights issues. So the big Beijing conference happened in 1995. Thousands and thousands of women from around the world came together to create this momentum and this movement. So I ended up being the Human Rights and Social Justice Program Officer for the Ford Foundation in New Delhi. And it was the first time that I had come back to India as an adult. It was my first job in India since I had left to go to college. And I really became deeply connected to the movements for Adivasi rights, for Dalit rights, for women's rights, public interest law in India, police reform. And through all of this work that I was doing, I was really trying to integrate the many different experiences that I had in doing human rights work over the many decades. And the thing that I started to feel was that those of us who were in the movement tended to spend a lot of time talking to each other. That we used language that we understood, that we attended meetings together, that we, if I went to see a documentary film on a social justice issue, I knew everybody in the room that was going to be there. And by this point, I was beginning to feel that the pandemic of violence against women, the pandemic of gender-based violence, was so enormous that the attempts that we were making to address this didn't seem commensurate with the size and scale of the problem. I think the other thing that I was getting really curious about, Sohini, was we had a lot of emphasis on law and policy and service actions to address violence. So we were always coming into a situation after the violation had happened, after a woman had been beaten or hurt or, forced into an early marriage, or the human rights violation had already taken place, and most of our responses were then trying to provide her with redress or punish the perpetrator. But we weren't really addressing the underlying cultural norms that were leading to this pandemic of violence in the first place. Now, I sound very wise right now about this insight. At the time, it was much more episodic. It was like, why the hell isn't this working? Or why can't people see that there are all of these hospitals in India? If you go to any of the women's wards, they're full of burn victims from dowry-inflicted violence. Why can't people see that the sex ratio is through the roof? Domestic violence, so I was like in this state of, whoa, rather than, we haven't understood cultural norms, la, 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 la. So I just want to be clear that I'm talking from hindsight rather than the energy of the moment. And so in the energy of that moment, I was like, if I wanted to reach lots of people, what would I do? What could I do? What is it that people actually engage with? And since I was in India at the time, it was music, it was Bollywood, it was the Indian film industry, a huge, deep culture of music, of every genre, from folk to classical, to pop, to rock, to jazz, to, regional variations on everything. Like, we just had a huge culture of music. And then, of course, Bollywood music was the grand unifier of the whole country. So I started to get curious about music as a way to communicate. And so I found these musician friends, and we kind of started to jam and come up with ideas for socially oriented songs, right? And we wrote these songs. One was about corruption. The other one was about pollution in Delhi. And so, we very earnestly would go through many bottles of wine, creating these songs and writing them in my living room. And I even went off to a studio and recorded them. And all the while really asking this question, right? How do we use culture to change culture? I ended up in Bombay, meeting with all of these folks in the entertainment industry. I took these songs with me to Bombay and played them, and they would kind of sit there and say, oh, what a beautiful voice this guy has, or great instrumentation, but you know what? Why don't you create the Spice Girls version in India? I took all of that advice and I went and listened to every indie pop album that was out at that time and started to get a better sense of the kind of vibe I wanted to create. So that's then how I started to pull together the team to create Manjeere, an album of women's dreams that then became the launch of Breakthrough.
That's fascinating. And why India and US?
So, I mean, at a very personal and kind of egoic level, I'm Indian American and I was creating an organization. So why not? I wasn't really thinking of creating an organization. At the time that I made Manjeere, I was more interested in experimenting with the idea of culture to change culture. I wanted to make sure that I wasn't creating an entity that was like, headquartered in the United States and the field office was in India. I mean, there was a whole way in which global organizations had a very colonial structure, right? So the West or the North was where the head office existed. And then if you worked in other parts of the world, those were your field offices. And I hated that structure. And I did not want Breakthrough to be replicating colonial structures. And so that was kind of the impetus, the creative impetus behind India and the United States.
Clearly you were ahead of your time, because if you see race issues in US or caste issues in India, there are legal reforms, there are laws, there are policies, but we know that if the culture doesn't change, people's mindset do not change, the people do not change, and things kind of continue in perpetuity. So this whole thing about culture changing culture, I mean, many people mean many things when they use this term. Could you, deconstruct it for us a little bit, please? I mean, what do you mean when you talk about using culture to change culture?
The way in which we think about culture, particularly in the human rights space, is quite limited or has been quite limited in the past, right? We tend to think about culture only as those norms and practices that infringe on rights, right? So the culture of arranged marriage. Culture with the big C is actually the sea that we all swim in. It's our food, it's our music, it's our clothes, it's the systems we create, whether it's educational systems or health systems or, familial systems. Like everything that we have created as humans exists within culture writ large. We also have very amazing dimensions to culture. I mean, we're just this incredibly creative species. The art, the expressions, the colors, the variations, the adaptations, the iterations. We're just such an incredibly creative species as well. So when I started to think about cultural norms that hurt women or that led to mostly men being violent towards women, and this is the context in which I was thinking about all of this, 20 years ago. If one is to communicate about these kinds of issues in a way that people can receive it, in a way that people's hearts and minds can be open to different ways of thinking about something, what might that be? I want people to pay attention to women's desires, women's dreams. How do I communicate that? And so when I started to think about the music album and the music video like that, I knew I needed to find partners, music directors, lyricists, who would also kind of resonate in that same frequency, if you will.
And in this whole, journey of culture change, what to you were one or two, maybe most significant achievements of Breakthrough during this whole journey?
Manjeere definitely was one of our biggest achievements. And I think about it fondly because, it was one of those achievements that happened when I didn't know what the hell I was doing. Getting that album and then creating the music video with Shujit Sharkar and the story arc of a woman who walks out of a domestic violence relationship, becomes a truck driver. So really challenging even the norms about public space and how women occupy public space and creating a visual cultural journey of women in solidarity together. None of us, nobody had ever really attempted to do anything like this before. So the fact that it ended up being top 10, reaching millions, music video won a gazillion awards. The whole country at the time was just talking about Manjeere. It was quite astonishing, actually. And people still remember that album and people still refer to that music video. And we ended up taking those music videos and those songs into schools And I think for many of the schools that we went into, Sohini, it was the first time that ever had a conversation about women's rights or domestic violence. The fact that everybody was watching this on television made it a lot more accessible and opened doors to schools and all kinds of spaces that I don't think we would have ever been able to walk into 20 years ago. I think the second one was I would lift up Iced, the first social change video game that we ever created. We were in the aftermath of 9/11. We were looking at huge violations of rights happening of immigrant communities, huge backlash against immigrants. South Asians and Muslims were at the receiving end of a lot of violence. And again, we were trying to find ways in which we could kind of cut through and reach people, because nobody in the entertainment industry wanted to touch immigrant rights. Right? So we're like, okay, we're going to make a video game. So we worked with 100 kids in high schools around New York City who came together in these kind of workshop modes where literally we created the characters of the game, the gameplay, what happened to these characters, how they ended up in detention and deportation. And it became a journey around very unfair immigration laws in the United States. Immigration laws that totally denied constitutional rights, that were incredibly racist, incredibly discriminatory, ended up having families totally destroyed, separated. People were dying in detention and deportation. Kids were growing up without their parents. So we called it Iced, I Can End Deportation. It really did generate a huge conversation. It brought people into a dialogue who had not historically even thought about immigrant rights or what was happening to immigrants or understanding the legal issues that were creating the problems. It also brought a lot of right-wing people who were very anti-immigrant into the mix.
Iced actually was used by a number of your partners in the US, wasn't that right?
Partnerships was always a very, very key pillar of Breakthrough's work, how we worked in the movement. Because if we were going to change culture, it needs a lot of us to be doing the work and really understanding how we all come together. So with Iced, a lot of our partner organizations were actually providing us with the information. So when we were recording conversations between a child and their parent in detention, we were recording real conversations that were being made possible because of partner groups that were actually working with detained people. So if wherever we could, we always brought in as many folks as possible so that it became a shared joint endeavor to try and change a particular human rights issue and do the culture piece around it.
I mean, you are South Asian and you're American, right? And there's a constant kind of balancing act between two cultures, two locations. How does it, or it doesn't at all, how does the culture and the location, diverse culture and the diverse location, informed the work that you did at Breakthrough?
I loved the complexity and the tapestry and the different dimensions that working in India and the United States in this grounded way provided me. It was a grand experiment. It was bloody difficult because everybody actually was still used to the old model. It's a good way for us to start checking how we walk our talk. If we are talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, pluralism, right? If we truly are committed to those values as, social justice people or people who think that learning how we all live together in this incredible variety that we are is a core dimension of being human, then the fact that we were experimenting with how to be deeply grounded in both countries was a grand experiment. There were lots of aspects of it that were a lot of fun, huge learning. It always made me think about things from multifaceted ways. It taught me a lot about culture change and where things are very specific and where things are very universal. Like if you think about pop culture, right? Doesn't matter whether you're in China or Korea or India or the United States, everybody knows who Madonna is, for example, right? So when it came to our consumption of pop culture, we didn't seem to have as much difficulty being universal in how we consumed it. But when it came to organizational issues, there were challenges. And, some of the issues were around cultural differences and people learning that, in India, everybody talks at the same time at the top of their lungs, for example. And in the United States, people are quiet and much more polite with one another. So when, folks from the US office would visit the India office, it would often be like a bit of a shock because just the environment in terms of how people work was so different. If Microsoft can be global and if Mahindra can be global, then why can't we? The culture of social change work where the orientation towards being conflictual or being in advocacy or being in a fight about something start to become ways in which we start even interacting with one another. And so, I'm not uplifting pop culture and the corporate world and capitalism as the answer to how we need to be together. So don't hear my responses in that way. But I think just becoming a little bit more curious about what's actually going on, more open to what's actually going on, and just remembering that, this is a grand, amazing experiment. And can we come at it from that place of, wow, we get a chance to play and create and think about things differently.
You decided to step down from Breakthrough when the organization was just poised for, really big things, just poised to kind of go to scale. What was that experience like? What were your initial doubts, fears? There must have been a few. And I know that I'm a part of that transition, but you can be totally frank, because I'm sure many in the audience would want to know what it is like to transition out of an organization that you founded.
Breakthrough was never kind of my forever after. When I produced Manjeere, I never intended to create an organization. Like that wasn't even part of what was in my head. So then when I found myself embarking on the creation of an organization, I tried to bring it as much integrity as I could. There was lovely things about being the president and the CEO, like I got to define my own time, represent the organization in all of these different ways. But I wasn't sort of in the creative, day-to-day space of the organization anymore. And I really missed that. We had also, in the process of getting larger and larger, and organizations have to do this, we had started to create systems and processes and lines of authority and leadership. And my own style of being in the world is just much more of a maverick. Like I'm just not I'm not at my best when I'm hewing to a lot of structure. I like structure and scaffolding because it enables creativity. But I think that there's a way in which nonprofit structures, or maybe all structures, like there are these very delicate balances that are hard to maintain. And my own personal balance of what gave me joy in my leadership had kind of tipped to a side where I really wasn't feeling joyful anymore. And I was deeply missing my own creative space and my ability to do stuff. And then the last thing really, Sohini, was I was just completely burnt out. I was really, really tired. And I wasn't just burnt out from Breakthrough. I was burnt out from 3 decades of human rights activism, in a culture of activism where we never took care of ourselves, where inner work and inner transformation were never seen as necessary components to leadership, where expectations around the kinds of hours we worked were, ridiculous. And then more deeply, I think none of us really pay enough attention to the levels of trauma that we ourselves end up bringing into our own bodies and into our own hearts and into our own lives from the work that we do, we are constantly engaging with some of the most horrible things that humans do to one another. Whether it's around race, whether it's around gender, whether it's around class, whether it's around religion, whether it's around ethnic identity, whether it's around age. I mean, we can be really, really, really horrible to each other. And we see that in all of the systemic inequalities that we are surrounded by. And when you're doing the work, I mean, in my lifetime, I must have worked with several thousand, if not more, women who have experienced violence. I don't know how many hundreds, thousands of people who've been at the receiving end of injustice because of immigration status or race status. And that's just me. That's just me within the organization. We're not even then taking into account everybody else in the organization. And that work is really hard. And I don't think we take the time to acknowledge just how much pain there is in this world, except when we're talking about it as an external thing, but how that pain and that grief and that rage and all of those emotions also live within us. And we don't create the cultures within our organizations to address those or think about our own well-being or organizational well-being or collective well-being. I get a lot of love from you about my departure and how I handled it and being a founder that left in the way that I did. And I deeply, deeply appreciate that, and I received that. And I just want to say that I think that we were able to create that transition and create that relationship of reciprocity also because of you. And so I also want to really uplift and honor the way in which you stepped into leadership in a very challenging moment, at a very challenging time.
A lot of that came from the mindfulness that you showed in taking a step backwards and letting the new leader come in and do things her way. And then that brings me to this whole culture of a culture that you actually kind of begun in Breakthrough, which is a culture of shared leadership. And I completely believe in that, and I believed in that. I see a manifestation even among the senior colleagues I have. They all kind of believe in that. In today's context, when there are organizations and we are hearing struggles about being inclusive, being diversified, being feminist, what does feminist leadership means to you? What makes you a great leader? What kind of styles did you adopt early enough in Breakthrough so that they kind of perpetuated beyond the transition?
I mean, I think that there's some parts of this that just have to do with my personality, right? I hate being in the weeds, okay? Like, I am not a micromanager because I don't desire to be a micromanager. We're all adults. We're all incredibly talented. If we come together and we decide on something, then whatever our respective roles and responsibilities are, let's just go do them. I think that the other thing that I would say for me is that I had already been in a lot of organizations before I started Breakthrough. So I kind of walked into Breakthrough with some learning around what I liked and what I didn't like. I did not want a colonial structure. Like, there was just no way in hell I was going to create and replicate that structure. At the same time, I also saw that when people are visionary and are creative and make things, we're all human. We all want to be seen. We all want to be recognized. As much as I've sort of shifted from Breakthrough, it does mean something to me to be seen as the founder of Breakthrough. It does mean something to me to be able to talk about the things that I did do and that I did accomplish or that I didn't accomplish in a way that allows me to own it, while understanding that my owning it doesn't mean that 20 other people can't also own it, right? I think that that's where we as leaders make a lot of mistakes. Shared leadership doesn't mean that we don't honor and recognize people for what they do. I think that we often think about shared leadership as then everybody's like the lowest common denominator and then nobody gets seen, right? Shared leadership is about making sure that all of the brilliance that came together to make something happen can be recognized in different ways. It was important for me to be mindful of wanting recognition for myself, while at the same time always looking for ways in which everyone else could also be recognized. And there were little practical things that I did to make sure that that happened. So one was around money and resource mobilization. A lot of people will hoard funder relationships, right? Like only the CEO will have a relationship with the Ford Foundation or whoever foundation, right? So from the get-go, I always wanted to bring more than myself into foundation meetings, right? So that the money piece wasn't being hoarded. The second thing that I was really mindful about early on was who talked to the press. I certainly wanted to talk to the press, and I wanted other people to talk to the press too. So, opening up representation in that way was also an important thing. I think that the third thing that I kind of did early on was decision making, how we make decisions. There's no grand answer, right? Like there's no like, if you do these three things, then this will happen. Why I think inner work is so important is that self-awareness as a leader is absolutely critical. If you're not self-aware and you're just acting out your shit on everybody around you, then, you're creating a mess around that. In terms of my relationship to Breakthrough now, I'll be completely honest. There are times when I really miss Breakthrough. I really miss the teams, my colleagues, the people that I conspired with and created with on a regular basis. My tendency to withdraw and make sure that I'm not crowding you or anyone else may be a little too extreme. It may be too much the other side because, in this dance of like, what's the great balance? We're in the process of creating new ways of how we can all live and lead and work together. So I also want to start releasing some of the old nonprofit hierarchies and structures and narratives and stories because, as you know, right now I'm obsessed with how we can all be interconnected. So that is asking me also then to stand in this place of reciprocity and generosity where we create spaciousness for everyone, but also understand, all of the things that keep us together.
And my last question is, as a leader who is a woman of color and a feminist, do you think that kind of added a dimension to the leadership and to the organization? How did you kind of, think about that, or did you not think about that at all?
I've never been asked this question, so I am reflecting on it as I speak. My self-definitions included feminist and woman of color, like from the get-go. I think the woman of color identity really began to grow for me, beginning in college, but really when I moved to New York after I graduated and I became a part of this incredible community of women of color, this amazing book called This Bridge Called My Back that had just come out, and it was kind of one of the first articulations of feminisms in the United States that were coming from Chicana and African American and indigenous and multiplicity of voices of what feminism looked like writ large, and then what were all of the ways in which it shape-shifted. The words of Audre Lorde were resonating, Toni Cade Bambara, Barbara Smith at that time, Kitchen Table Press. Like it was like one of those incredibly rich moments, early 80s, of all of these voices that were emerging, at least in the US context. I was an immigrant. I happened to be from India. And I also happened to be an upper caste Indian. I also happened to be a Brahmin. I also happened to come from a fair amount of class privilege. By the time I got to law school, the idea of intersectionality had already been articulated by Kim Crenshaw. The feminist dialogue was women of color in the United States, but it was a global dialogue because I was also an Indian feminist, right? Like it was early on a feminism that was being informed by a multiplicity of approaches and identities and cultures and flavors and colors. And so, yeah, I mean, I'm sure that all of that informed how I then created or thought about Breakthrough. So certainly being committed to creating an anti-colonial or a non-colonial, not even an anti, a non-colonial structure in incorporating India and the United States and saying we were going to work in both countries, not that the US was going to be supporting India or that India was going to be the field office for the US. Certainly that came from a very strong anti-colonial, anti-imperial impulse in terms of my feminist identity. In terms of sharing power, a lot of it was making it up, making up a new organizational structure, making up culture change. Culture change didn't even exist as a field. Like nobody knew what the hell I was talking about. So much shifted in the 20 years as we were iterating, adapting, creating, experimenting, building, structuring, unstructuring, fighting, loving, exploring, coming together, falling apart. Yeah, it was quite an incredible journey.
Thank you, Mallika Dutt. This was just fascinating and, super innovator, leader, and somebody who came into it not just with her whole being, but with this whole idea of planet, people, everybody kind of showing up. Yeah. Thank you so much for having this conversation with us today. And thanks to our audience for joining us for this episode of Breakthrough Spotlight. We are a nonprofit organization that relies on contributions and support from our viewers. So please consider making a tax-deductible donation through the link in the description. We also hope that you will subscribe, like, and share to stay up to date with our work and future episodes. This is Sohini wishing you a safe and happy day. Bye.